Would you be surprised to know that right now the federal workforce is smaller relative to the US population than it has been in over half a century? For decades, the federal workforce has been shrinking relative to the size of the US population and the US economy. At the time of Donald Trump's birth, federal workers made up 4.5% of non farm employees. Today, that number has dropped to just 1.5%, a threefold decrease. Despite popular claims that the federal government is bloated, the reality is that it has become too small to effectively meet the needs of the American people, which is why it seems bogged down and inefficient. Now, I'm not saying we should triple the size of the federal workforce, since making broad workforce change decisions just for the sake of making them is very dumb. But the federal workforce has done more with less people year over year since the 1940s. The ratio of federal workers to the number of Americans they service dropped below one federal worker per 100 Americans in 2007, and it has not recovered. Currently, each federal worker services about 115 Americans. But it's not just Americans. They deal with immigrants, foreign policy, and other overseas diplomatic and national security efforts. The consequences of a reduced federal workforce are evident across multiple sectors, including air traffic control, veterans healthcare, financial oversight, and immigration courts. In air traffic control, for instance, the tragic crash of an American Airlines jet into a U.S. Army helicopter on January 29th highlighted the dangers of an understaffed government. At the time of the crash, only 2 air traffic controllers were performing the work of 4. Across the country, many air traffic control centers are severely understaffed, with some facilities operating with only 60% of their needed personnel. In veterans healthcare, the Veterans Health Administration is experiencing critical staffing shortages, with 86% of facilities reporting shortages in doctors and 82% reporting nursing shortages. These shortages lead to delayed or suboptimal care for veterans, affecting their quality of life, and then they complain and say that the federal government isn't working for them. In banking oversight, the lack of Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, examiners contributed to the collapse of Signature Bank and Silicon Valley Bank in 2023. The FDIC's limited workforce struggled to monitor financial institutions effectively, allowing financial risks to grow unchecked. In immigration courts, while Congress has expanded funding for border enforcement agencies, it has failed to provide sufficient resources for immigration courts, leading to a backlog of over 1 million cases. Underfunding this system resulted in long delays and legal uncertainty for thousands of individuals who then just decided to cross illegally anyway. IRS enforcement has taken a hit. Each year, the U.S. loses billions of dollars in tax revenue due to understaffing at the Internal Revenue Service. Thanks to modernization funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS was able to hire more employees and improve enforcement. However, Congress has since cut funding, and Donald Trump is threatening to axe many of the agency's personnel, if not the entire agency itself. Despite the perception that the federal government has grown too large, data shows otherwise. Federal civilian employment has remained relatively stable since the 1960s, even as the U.S. population has increased by 68% and federal spending has quintupled. Federal programs in that amount of time have quadrupled. This raises important questions. How is the government managing to do more with the same number of employees? Well, one answer lies in the increasing reliance on private contractors. Today, private contractors outnumber federal employees by more than 2 to 1. Yet there is very little discussion in reducing them because they are seen as private employees. They are private sector workers whose failures are actually blamed on the federal workforce instead of that contractor, because they're hiding behind the shield of the agency or administration they have a contract with. And while contractors can be useful for certain tasks, the lack of oversight and transparency creates challenges. Halliburton KBR and burn pits are one example. Blackwater is another. DynCorp in Bosnia, Tribute with FEMA, the list goes on. Some argue that outsourcing diminishes government expertise and accountability, while others believe it allows civil servants to focus on their core mission. The reality is likely somewhere in between. And that list is not a catch-all. There are great contractors out there doing their jobs and working diligently with their federal counterparts. Many were federal workers in some capacity, but if you want less accountability, then make the federal workforce contractors. Could you imagine if the contractors servicing Social Security or veterans benefits payments suddenly went under or decided not to renew their contract, meaning new bids would have to be opened? What a mess that would be, and it could impact payments. Unlike past government reform efforts, such as Bill Clinton's National Performance Review, which focused on efficiency and performance, the Trump administration's plan primarily targets just broad slashes to the workforce and reductions in a blanketed effort. However, cutting federal employees further without addressing staffing shortages in critical areas could have serious consequences. Sure, there are exemptions to law enforcement and benefits administrators, but the back end folks who support these frontline workers, those in IT or HR or other areas, enable those frontline workers to do their job. So rather than indiscriminately reducing the federal workforce, there needs to be a more strategic approach. Either we privatize, which we've seen the unmitigated disaster that has become in the prison system, or we can outsource using contracts, but that also requires stronger oversight. Or, as my hope is, perhaps we can reinvent the bureaucracy. Government agencies should adopt to modern management practices, improve customer service, and leverage technology to increase efficiency. Use Silicon Valley and other experts in those sectors. And this is where a little-known agency that I'm aware of comes into play. It's an example of a successful program in the Department of Defense, and it is called the Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU. Originally designed to help the Department of Defense rapidly adopt emerging technology, DIU has demonstrated how streamlined procurement, agile innovation, and public-private partnerships can transform complex bureaucracies. Now, the challenge is scaling this success across the entire federal government. Imagine a government where every agency has its own agency innovation unit, a dedicated team tasked with identifying mission-critical challenges, partnering with industry leaders, and implementing cutting-edge solutions. These AIUs would be tailored to each agency's unique needs. The Department of Energy could focus on grid modernization and clean energy. The Department of Veterans Affairs could revolutionize healthcare delivery with AI-driven diagnostics. The Department of Transportation could develop next-generation traffic management systems. To ensure cohesion and prevent duplication across agencies, a federal innovation hub could serve as a centralized oversight body housed within the Office of Management and Budget or even General Services Administration. This hub would provide funding, set procurement standards, and facilitate cross-agency collaboration, ensuring that successful innovations are shared rather than siloed. One of DIU's most significant advantages is its ability to bypass traditional slow-moving acquisition processes. They leverage things like other transaction authorities, or OTAs, and public-private partnerships to deploy new technologies in months rather than years. Expanding this procurement flexibility across federal agencies would allow them to rapidly test, scale, and integrate solutions without being bogged down by excess red tape. To support this modernization, we can have a federal AI task force that would work across agencies to identify common AI applications, enhance fraud detection, and improve policy decision-making through data analytics. And all of this could be shared and collaborated across a federal data sharing model. Beyond structural changes, though, this shift requires a cultural transformation, moving away from the traditionally risk-averse mindset of federal agencies towards a more mission-driven innovation approach, which fosters agile methodologies, tech fellowships, and interagency rotations. Agencies could then attract top talent and create an environment where rapid problem solving is the norm. For this vision to succeed, it would require strong legislative and executive support, something we don't have right now. Even DIU struggles to get the funding it needs. Just as DIU has proven its value in national defense, a government-wide expansion of its principles could modernize federal operations, reduce inefficiencies, and ultimately improve the lives of millions of Americans. We need a scalpel, not a chainsaw. We need a thoughtful process, not a bludgeon. And the method of moving fast and break things in Silicon Valley doesn't work when people's livelihoods and their lives are on the line in the broader federal government.